It's a pleasure for me to be back at the University of Texas, and particularly to be at the Strauss Center. Now, as many of you know, Ambassador Strauss, among his many career achievements, actually started off as a special agent for the FBI. I thought it particularly ungracious of me to criticize the FBI today, which I have done in many of my past work. So I decided to pick a topic of intelligence dysfunction that everyone can get around and agree to, and that is Congress. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. What I'm presenting is actually a paper that is going to be a forthcoming book from the Hoover Institution, and the small part of the paper is going to be appearing in a journal, Political Science Quarterly, for any masochistic geeks who want to read it in the next few months. So you're going to get sort of the sneak peek at the data, and I'm going to tell you, I always say political scientists say what everyone else already intuitively knows to be true. I'm going to tell you about the sources of problems in intelligence oversight. Okay. So let me just set the table a little bit. If we think about now, we're just finished with the 9th anniversary of 9/11. In the past 9 years since 9/11, we've seen some pretty dramatic changes in the executive branch in the intelligence community. Just to give you a couple of examples, we have the 9/11 Commission up there recommending the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, right? A new intelligence czar. We also have the National Counterterrorism Center. What you may not know is we now have more than 70 state and local fusion centers that are supposed to coordinate intelligence threat reporting across the country. Of course, the creation of DHS, the largest reorganization of the executive branch since 1947. And we have efforts by the FBI to transform itself from a law enforcement organization to a domestic intelligence organization. Now, I'd be the first to tell you that not all changes signify improvement. As I tell my own students frequently, effort is not the same thing as success. But, and as we see, the Christmas Day bomb plot and the Times Square bomb plot remind us all too well that there are lingering and serious deficiencies in executive branch intelligence agencies. But the overall picture that you see from 9/11 is that there's a lot of change going on. There's a lot of effort in the executive branch to adapt to the rise of the terrorist threat. That is not true in Congress. Okay? So the persistence of congressional oversight weaknesses in intelligence has gotten very little attention in the media and very little attention in the academic debate. And I can tell you it's not because intelligence oversight of intelligence is working well. Just to give you some idea, since the Cold War's end, we've had several task forces, blue ribbon commissions, and even the intelligence committees themselves criticizing intelligence oversight and calling for major reforms. And perhaps one of the strangest occurrences, the Senate Intelligence Committee just 3 years ago held a hearing about itself and how it could improve its own job. So distraught were members of the committee about their own weaknesses in overseeing the Intelligence Committee that they actually called people to testify to them about them, which leads to the critical question that I explore in this paper, which is why have we had such lingering problems in intelligence oversight, both before 9/11 and after 9/11? Or for you political scientists in the room, more precisely, why do we have inputs that are varying dramatically? We have the crisis of 9/11. We have changing leaders in the intelligence committees. We have changing parties controlling the White House. Why, despite all of these changing inputs, do we have the same bad outcome when it comes to intelligence oversight in the Congress? From a political science perspective, that's an interesting problem. From a policy perspective, it's an important problem because it suggests that there are entrenched barriers to improving congressional oversight of intelligence agencies. It's not simply a matter of personalities or leadership. There's something more systematic going on. Now, in recent years, the conventional wisdom has blamed weak congressional oversight on the executive branch, right? So we hear a lot, particularly during the Bush administration, about executive branch secrecy and the Bush administration's expansive constitutional claims of executive authority. And while those things are an important part of the equation, they are by no means the only part of the equation. And what I find in my research is that many of Congress's biggest oversight problems lie with Congress, not with the executive branch. And these two deficiencies in particular, right? So the two that I focus on the most, and I'll talk about a lot more, is limited expertise and weak budgetary authority. What I find is that Congress has actually developed rules and practices to prohibit itself from cultivating expertise in intelligence issues. Okay, and I'll get into more what I mean in a minute. And in addition, Congress actually has very fragmented budgetary authority over the intelligence community. Now, these two weaknesses are no surprise to anyone on Capitol Hill, and they're not accidental. Members of Congress and intelligence observers have known about them for a long time. And the reason that they continue to persist, despite the awareness of the debilitating effects of these weaknesses, are the things on the right-hand side of the slide. There are two powerful reasons why the status quo is hard to change. Reason number one, electoral incentives. As I'll explain, if you look at the re-election motives of members of Congress, they incentivize legislators to focus on other issues at the expense of intelligence oversight. And reason number two is the dirtiest four-letter word in Washington, and that is turf, right? Protecting institutional prerogatives of existing committee systems in Congress. Very hard to change committee jurisdictions, okay? Okay, so let me spend a little bit of time delving into the academic literature. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I don't want your eyes to glaze over too soon, especially if you haven't gotten your cookies yet. But basically, there are two sets of academic literature that try to get a handle on intelligence oversight. And what I find is neither one actually explains what's going on very well. That's good, right? Because if they did, then I wouldn't have a paper to present. So the first set of literature is political science, broad theories of oversight in general. And the second is the intelligence studies literature. And what I find is that the political science work is too broad and pays too little attention to intelligence. The intelligence studies literature, by contrast, is too narrow and pays too much attention to intelligence. Let me give you a couple of examples to make it a little less abstract. There are two major models of oversight in the political science literature. The first of these is called police patrol oversight. And the basic idea is that congressional committees serve like police cars, constantly scanning the horizon, looking for wrongdoing in agencies in the executive branch, trying to catch wrongdoers, correct the abuses, and deter future wrongdoers from committing other mistakes or abuses, right? So it's active, it's central, and it's direct, right? So now the best work on police patrol oversight, arguably, is my colleague at UCLA, Joel Aberbach's book called Keeping a Watchful Eye. And what he does is he actually tracks metrics of oversight. How many committee hearings does Congress hold? How much legislation does Congress pass? Sort of how active are these police patrols? And what he finds is from the 60s to the 80s, Congress dramatically increased its level of activity and oversight. But the problem with this work is that it takes Congress as a whole, Congress as a unit of analysis. And what Joel Aberbach doesn't do is ask, does oversight vary by policy domain? Are these police patrols more vigorous in some policy areas than other policy areas? And what I find when you replicate his analysis from the 80s to the present day is it varies dramatically. So the intelligence committees rank at the very bottom of all the committees that I looked at in Congress. I looked at 15 different committees in terms of how many hearings they hold, how much legislation they're producing. Okay? So the police patrol model doesn't account for variation across policy domains. Doesn't give us a sense of where intelligence fits in the picture. Second political science oversight model is called the fire alarm oversight model. And by contrast, this model argues that members of Congress aren't out there scanning, constantly looking for wrongdoing. What they do is actually very clever. They sit back and they put fire alarms in the neighborhoods, and they empower interest groups and concerned citizens and third parties to notify them when things go wrong in the bureaucracy. That way, Congress doesn't actually have to expend any effort overseeing these agencies unless their constituents really, really care about it. Right? So it's very efficient for members of Congress. But for this kind of oversight model to work, you have to have interest groups. Right? The system only works if there's somebody to pull the fire alarm. And in the intelligence world, there are very, very few and weak interest groups. And the ones that are there often don't know what's going wrong. And if you can't see the smoke in the executive branch because of secrecy, you can't pull the fire alarm. So big problems with both of these very general, very accepted models in political science. Don't take the realities of intelligence into account. Now, the flip side is the intelligence literature, which has the opposite problem. In general, the intelligence studies literature likes to talk about changing oversight through the ages, looking at individual committee chairmen or the role of individual issues. Now, this is an important exercise, an important narrative. But what that narrative misses is all of those underlying factors that make oversight weak across time, across committee chairmen, across a changing cast of characters and events. Okay? So what I do instead is start from a different perspective. Instead, I ask, if you were a member of Congress and you wanted to exercise vigorous oversight, what weapons would be most important to you? And the answer is two: expertise and money. Right? Because if you have expertise, you can ask good questions and get good answers. And if you have money, people pay attention to what you're doing when you're in Washington. Right? So let me start with expertise. As one congressional staffer put it to me when I interviewed him, most of what we do in oversight is through the asking of questions. Right? This makes sense intuitively. The more a committee knows about a policy domain, the better questions it can ask, the more likely it is to detect problems or violations of the law, and the more likely it is to correct them. Right? So expertise is critical. So there are three main ways for Congress to develop institutional expertise on a policy issue. The first of these is homegrown knowledge. Right? If you assume, as it's pretty reasonable to assume, that members of Congress prefer winning re-election to losing re-election, they know that they have to become experts on their district's key industries before they ever get to Washington. Right? And they have to stay abreast of their district's key industries if they want to keep their job. Well, what this means is that people walk in the door of the Capitol with some expertise on their district's main issues. The second way to develop expertise institutionally is on-the-job learning. And here, principally, I'm thinking about rules that incentivize members to specialize. So unlimited service on a committee would be one way to develop specialization and expertise. Seniority, benefits to seniority for chairmanships, for example, would also encourage members to devote time to becoming more expert in a particular policy issue. And then the third route is, if members of Congress aren't going to become experts, you can augment or supplement that expertise by outsourcing to staff. Right? So you can hire your personal staff, your committee staff, or outsource to, I try not to throw too many acronyms here, Congressional Budget Office, Congressional Research Service, Government Accountability Office, right? The main staff agencies supporting Congress. Okay? But what we find is actually all three sources of expertise are far more robust in other policy areas than intelligence. Right? So let's start on the top. Almost nobody walks in the door of Congress an intelligence expert. In part, it's because intelligence is a very technical and complicated policy area that takes years to master. Just to give you some idea, of the 535 current members of Congress, 2 have ever served in an intelligence agency before. By contrast, typically about a third of the Armed Services Committee members have previous experience in the military. So they have a sense, sort of a baseline knowledge about how the military works that members on the intelligence committees don't have. Okay? Now, instead, understanding intelligence takes the one thing in shortest supply for a member of Congress: time. Right? That's costly. Now, more specifically, there's a sort of a trifecta of problems that limit the ability of Congress to actually get homegrown expertise. And they are inattentive voters, weak interest groups, and bad geography. Let me go through each one of those. Inattentive voters. Well, ever since the 1950s, political scientists have found that when it comes time to vote, American citizens care far more about domestic issues than foreign policy issues. In the last 20 years, despite the end of the Cold War, globalization, 9/11, and 2 wars in Iraq, foreign policy has never been rated in exit polls the #1 issue when people talk about how they vote for president. Never in the past 20 years. And in 2 elections, in 1996 and in 2000, foreign policy rated dead last among voters' most important issues, below even moral values and crime. Okay? Now we know, and this is presidential elections. This isn't even congressional elections, which are much more local affairs. Right? So that's inattentive voters. In addition to that, we have weak interest groups in intelligence. I had a team of research assistants who doggedly pursued this question for the past year, and they tracked 25,000 interest groups and what policy area they were most concerned with. And of those 25,000 interest groups, which were all of the interest groups listed in the Encyclopedia of Associations, the answer is only 4% were concerned with foreign policy writ large, including everything defense-related, foreign policy-related, Afghanistan-related, North Korea-related, and a tiny fraction of those were concerned with intelligence. Right? So the overwhelming majority of interest groups focused on issues other than intelligence. I also looked at power of interest groups, and I can talk about that more if you want in Q&A. In addition to that, then we have bad geography. And what do I mean by bad geography? Intelligence is a national policy issue. And because it's a national issue, people who care deeply about it are spread across different congressional districts. They're not concentrated in any one location, any one state. Anyone who runs for office from Iowa knows that he better know agricultural policy because farm interests are clustered in Iowa. Right? Doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you better know agriculture policy because you have strong reelection incentives to know it. Right? There is no Iowa for intelligence. Right? There are clusters of defense contractors in some places, but nothing close to what we have for an Iowa for intelligence. Okay? So there's no concentration of geographic interest that incentivizes legislators to learn the intelligence business or lose their job. Okay? So homegrown expertise is not likely to get better. What about on-the-job learning? Well, here now there's something very interesting going on. It turns out that Congress has actually deliberately tied its hands in intelligence and almost nowhere else when it comes to encouraging members to learn on the job. 90% of the committees in Congress have unlimited service, right? So if you're on a committee and you get reelected, you can stay on that committee forever, okay? And what that means is that you actually develop much more expertise. So presumably, the longer you serve, the more you learn. It may not always be the case, but one would hope that that is the case, right? Where that's not true is the intelligence committees, which have term limits for their members. The House Intelligence Committee still has term limits for its members, and the Senate Intelligence Committee had term limits for almost 30 years, abolishing them just in 2005. Okay? And what this means is that once a member actually understands the intelligence business after 6 or 7 years, they have to get off the committee and go somewhere else. Okay? Now, why do we have term limits? Well, the conventional wisdom is that they were originally created to prevent co-optation. The idea was that Congress didn't want legislators to get captured by the intelligence agencies they were overseeing. So they wanted to filter new people through to prevent that from happening. But that same logic of preventing capture was never applied to most of the other committees in Congress. Right? And in fact, term limits persisted for years despite repeated calls to abolish them, including calls from the House Intelligence Committee's own staff, right, recommending that term limits be abolished. What I argue is that electoral self-interest explains more of why these term limits still exist in the House and why they persisted for so long in the Senate. For most members of Congress, overseeing intelligence is kind of the worst of all worlds. It takes a lot of time, it's very costly, and there are no benefits that you can deliver to your constituents back home. You can't even talk about what you do with your constituents back home. It turns out that the data suggests that service on the intelligence committees is not so attractive, and in fact is getting less attractive over time. while there are always some politicians who want to burnish their national security credentials by serving on the intelligence committees, in general, the most powerful members of Congress are serving on those committees less frequently now than they have ever done in the past. Now, the way I did this was by making a catalog of what I call the movers and shakers in Congress. So these are party leaders, so both the majority party and the minority party, chairman of all the committees, members of the really powerful committees like Appropriations, and I looked at what percent of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committees had movers and shakers on them, right? So it's a pretty good proxy for how important those committees, or how attractive those committees are. If the most powerful people in Congress are on them, they're pretty important. Turns out that the percentage of movers and shakers has declined dramatically since the 1980s. In 1987, 73% of the Senate Intelligence Committee members were movers and shakers in the Senate. 73%. In 2007, that number had dropped to 33%. It's a pretty big drop. Same pattern in the House. Okay. So given the costs and benefits of serving on the intelligence committees, term limits are kind of an electoral godsend, enabling that members can roll off the committee and serve on other committees that can better deliver benefits to folks back home. The impact of term limits is pretty substantial. It turns out that term limits, as you would imagine, have created a very big expertise gap between other committees and the intelligence committees. And this puts that gap into sort of visual perspective. What this is showing is I'm comparing three congressional committees: Armed Services, Banking, and Intelligence. And what I'm tracking here is over a long period of time from 1975 to 2008, what percent of the committee is long-termers? And I define long-termers by serving 10 years or more, so 5 terms or more in the committee, okay? And you'll see here, because of term limits, the Armed Services Committee has about a third of its members are long-termers over this period, right? Presumably more expert because they've served on the committee a long time. About a quarter in the Banking Committee and less than 5% in the Intelligence Committee. And that's generous because it's counting people who are moving on and off the committee, right? So they get the term limit, they might come back on, right? So the percentage of long-termers is much lower in the intelligence committees than the others. And in fact, in some years, it's shocking how many members of the committee are brand new to the committee. In the 103rd Congress, for example, which was one of the highest turnover years, 2/3 of the committee members were brand new to the Intelligence Committee. Former CIA Director Mike Hayden told me, and I love this quote, "Term limits are stupid. I don't know why they still have them, but they are hanging themselves." This from the former CIA director, right? Okay, so if you go back, so I've talked about homegrown expertise, committee term limits, not a lot of outsourcing to staff either. In fact, the Senate Intelligence Committee staff has shrunk from 1977 to the current day. It's shrunk by about 15%, while the role of intelligence has increased and the budget for intelligence has dramatically expanded. So we have increasing responsibilities and budgetary authority in the intelligence community and decreasing staff capabilities to oversee it. Okay. Let me turn to power of the purse. So that's expertise. Budgetary authority is the second powerful oversight weapon. Lee Hamilton once said, all of us have to live by the golden rule in Washington, and the golden rule is that he who controls the gold makes the rules. Vested in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, Congress's budgetary power has been interpreted since colonial days as a two-step process. Congress first authorizes an agency or program, and then it funds the agency or program through an appropriations. That's a separate piece of legislation. So broadly speaking, Congress is divided between most of the committees, which are called authorizing committees, like the intelligence committees are authorizing committees, and the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate. Okay. Now, this setup was supposed to ensure that authorizing committees would develop subject matter expertise, which would be helpful, and that appropriators would develop fiscal expertise that would guard against excessive spending. So this was a deliberate split between authorizations and appropriations. Okay? But this bifurcated system also ensures that the authorizing committees, insert here intelligence committees, authorizing committee power only goes so far. Authorizers can threaten to cut budgets, but the appropriations committees have to deliver on those threats. Okay? Wielding the power of the purse effectively requires coordinating between the authorizers on the one hand and the appropriators on the other. And executive branch agencies have the incentive to game this system, appealing to the appropriators if their authorizing committees do something they don't like. Or in other words, I call this the two-parent theory of budgetary politics. If mom says no, go to dad, right? It's exactly the same dynamic. Now, in theory, there are two things that should actually mitigate this end-run problem in the budgetary process: availability of information and budgetary workloads. So the idea here is that the more information that you have publicly available about what's going on, and the more manageable the budget workload, the more likely it is that the committees will know what the other committees are doing. And they'll be able to coordinate better between the authorizers and the appropriators. And those clever executive branch agency officials won't be able to go to dad if mom says no, because everybody knows about it, right? But it turns out that here, too, intelligence is in much worse shape than other policy areas. Let me start. I'm going to go down this part of the slide first, and then we'll get to intelligence. In terms of information availability, in the unclassified world, information is widely available, right? There are interest groups and reporters and concerned citizens, and for the most part, they have pretty easy access to information about executive branch agencies. Okay? Interest groups in particular can funnel information to their favorite legislators, serving as kind of low-cost information providers. Now, in addition, the budget workload in all policy areas other than defense is dramatically lower, okay? Orders of magnitude lower. Okay? The Appropriations Committee is divided into 12 subcommittees. The Defense Subcommittee has by far, and they handle the intelligence budget, by far the biggest workload of any of those other subcommittees. In fact, it has 10 times, the Defense Subcommittee has 10 times the budget workload of 9 of the other committees. Okay? So out of 12, it has 10 times the workload of 9 of the others. And the other 2 have much lower workloads as well, but not quite so severe. Okay? So big difference here. So we have very small workloads in all these other subcommittees, which enables better coordination. Okay? Now, and so the upshot is that executive branch agencies have a harder time gaming this system. And they have a harder time because information is plentiful and it's transparent to everyone concerned in Congress. And authorizers get the last word. If they recommend cutting a program and agencies ignore them or try to bypass them to get what they want from appropriators, then the authorizers can complain. They can offer amendments, and they can make changes even on the Senate floor. And here's the important part. Everybody knows this is how the system works. And that enhances the credibility of the threat to begin with. So if mom says no and dad says yes, mom finds out about it and punishes everybody. And everybody knows this from the beginning, right? Which keeps it from happening in the first place, or at least lowers the possibility that it will happen, okay? Now let's look at the intelligence world. Very different world, right? Where gaming is much more likely to happen. There we see information is classified, severely limited. Restrictions apply that make getting information onerous and limit the people who can receive it. Okay? Legislators on the intelligence committees can gain access to information, but everybody else, including their personal staffs, cannot. Okay? So very few personal staffers in Congress hold security clearances. And the ones that do often don't have high enough clearances to do intelligence work. Okay? And in addition, members on these committees can look at classified budget documents, but they have to do so in a secured location. And at least according to my interviews, very many of them don't bother to make the schlep to the classified location to do their homework, right? Because once you have to move to somewhere else, it takes more time, and it's less likely to get done. Okay? And so what these information restrictions do is they give the executive branch tremendous information advantage. Okay? So in the classified intelligence world, it's much harder for one committee to know what another committee is doing. Okay? In addition to that, we have the big budget workload problem, right? The Defense Appropriations Subcommittee is dealing with $500 billion in budget discretionary spending a year. And the intelligence budget constitutes a small percentage of that, which means it doesn't get paid a lot of attention. So the people with the expertise in the intelligence committees are actually not the people making final decisions about how that money is spent. Okay? And so the upshot of this environment with workloads and information is that the environment is ripe for gaming. Okay? Intelligence authorizing committees will take big items out, and then the appropriators put them right back in. Now, this is not just some academic theoretical problem that I've concocted for the benefit of this paper. It's a real problem that has been happening for years in Washington. Let me give you one example of this. This is a New York Times story from 2004 that talks about a very unusual situation. Senator Rockefeller, who was then the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, so the vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, goes on the Senate floor and publicly objects to a classified intelligence program, which he did not name. And this is the beauty of this program, right? It costs $9.5 billion. It's a spy satellite program. It's more than double, not almost double what it was expected to cost. It was a $5 billion program that ended up costing $9.5 billion. Here's my favorite part. Could take photographs only in daylight hours and in clear weather. This is not the optimal satellite system, right? This is a clunker, okay? So what happens is the Senate Intelligence Committee votes twice on a bipartisan basis to kill this program because it's bad, right? Wasteful, ineffective, and what happens? The intelligence community goes around the authorizers, gets the appropriators to say yes, and it survives, okay? And so Rockefeller is so upset about this that he goes on the Senate floor and he says, my decision to take this somewhat unprecedented action is based solely on my strenuous objection, shared by many others in my committee, to a particular major funding acquisition program. Note he doesn't name it because he doesn't want to reveal classified information, that I believe is totally unjustified and very wasteful and dangerous to national security. So what happens? Well, I can tell you this was not a good day for Senator Rockefeller. He suffered politically as a result of this public declaration. It created a firestorm. Republican leaders considered disciplinary action against the senators who spoke for talking about the program, even though they didn't identify it. The Justice Department was asked to review it, and Rockefeller was inundated with phone calls from talk show, because of radio talk show programs, from angry constituents. And yet, the program continued to get funded until 2007, when finally the Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, killed it. Okay, so it lasted a lot longer than it should have. This is not an isolated problem. It turns out that there have been at least 3 of these very expensive programs, both objected to by the Senate Intelligence Committee on a bipartisan basis. 2 of them have been killed. 1 of them has not. All of them went on much longer than they should have. Okay? So this is a sort of a poster child example of the end run problem in the budgetary process in Congress. Okay? Now, why do budget reforms fail? Why do we have this crazy system if we know that it leads to ineffective satellites and overspending on satellite programs? Well, like expertise, Congress's budgetary weaknesses over the intelligence community is well known, and efforts to fix it have floundered for years. Before 9/11, the Hart-Rudman Commission, the most comprehensive commission looking at national security since World War II, recommended improving national security by, among other things, consolidating those appropriation powers in the intelligence committees and the authorizing committees. After 9/11, consolidating those powers was the principal congressional recommendation by the 9/11 Commission as well. And instead, the House in 2007 decided to keep appropriations powers in the Appropriations Committee. It created a sort of sub-panel on intelligence that had non-binding recommendations. You don't need a graduate degree to know that non-binding recommendations aren't usually very powerful. And the Senate committee actually took even less action, creating a notional appropriations subcommittee on intelligence that has never actually met. And so budgetary reforms have failed for the same reasons that they arose in the first place. The first reason is turf. The current split between authorizers and appropriators maintains Congress's internal distribution of power, right? Few things are as sacrosanct in Congress as the power of the Appropriations Committee. There's an old joke on Capitol Hill that in Congress there are Democrats, there are Republicans, and there are appropriators, right? And the second reason is, again, those good old electoral incentives. So the current system actually serves everybody's interests well. It serves their interests because they're better off at gaining re-election on the outside and protecting their power on the inside. What the current system doesn't serve is the national interest very well. Now, let me conclude before we open it up for questions with a couple of implications, both for theory and practice. On the theoretical side, I think that the work on congressional oversight and intelligence suggests there's a lot more interesting oversight work to be done. For those of you who like to get your hands dirty on congressional data, there's plenty more for you to do. Oversight appears to vary in systematic ways for systematic reasons. Intelligence is different, but it's not so different that the normal explanations of politics don't apply. It's an extreme case that sheds light on other oversight dynamics more broadly. And I think there's a lot more mileage to be gotten out of looking at variation in oversight across different policy areas. The second theoretical implication is the benefits of cross-pollination. Not only, as I put up here, between political science and intelligence studies, but between different disciplines and within subfields in political science. When we start to look at gaps in our knowledge is the way that we begin to fill them. Let me suggest two implications for practitioners. There's that great movie, Apollo 13, where Gene Kranz, the flight director, says, "Gentlemen, what have we got in that ship that's any good?" Right? This is sort of how you feel about congressional oversight. It's not particularly an encouraging picture. It looks like intelligence oversight is unlikely to improve in the Obama administration, even though we have Democratic control of both the White House and both houses of Congress, at least for the next month. Right? In the same way that it's unlikely to improve if we had unified control in a Republican administration. And the reason it's unlikely to improve, no matter which party is in power or whether they have unified or divided government, is because the roots of weak congressional oversight have to do with the incentives that drive all legislators to behave in certain ways. It has very little to do with divided or unified government or which party controls parts of the government. And then the last implication stems from the third one, which is don't count on big oversight improvements anytime soon. If I'm right, then oversight will be exceptionally difficult to improve. Electoral self-interest on the inside and protection of turf, or rather on the outside, and protection of turf on the inside have hindered the development of expertise and weakened budgetary authority over intelligence for a very long time. And these constraints are not about to go away anytime soon. As one congressional staffer told me, intelligence oversight is not impossible, but without mechanisms to foster greater expertise and stronger budgetary authority, it is considerably more difficult and often very crude. And he has this wonderful metaphor that he shared with me that he said I could use. He said, overseeing the intelligence community is like trying to carve the statue of David, he said, when all you have is a butter knife and a stick of dynamite. And on that note, I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I'm happy calling on people. That's all right. Yeah? Yes.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Zegart, for your presentation. You began by, I guess, with a broad assumption that implies that with better increased oversight, therefore there is better security. And so, on your points on expertise. On the job training, sourcing the staff. If we were to draw a parallel, for instance, post-World War II, where we saw a whole generation then roll into Congress that had military experience, and at some level, even at the lieutenant level or captain level or above, have some base knowledge dealing with intelligence every day at some level of degree. Have you considered that with after 8 years of war, and we have seen an empirical increase in the number of former or current military personnel who have run for political office, that the idea of both the homegrown expertise and or the outsourcing to staff who are, in addition, prior service members, that those two components of what you described might improve, number one. And then the second item I was going to ask is in terms of the term limit concept. Is that to say then pre-term limits that oversight was better? And then I couldn't agree with you more on the purse piece, but I would ask is, has appropriations on the intel side increased over the course of the last 8 years or post 9/11? And has that, even in its appropriation, then I guess it's just a question of effectiveness or efficiencies. So just kind of throw all those guys.
You got a lot of questions. Easy question. Yeah, thanks for the easy questions. Okay. Let me start with your first question. Actually, I want to add one question to your list, which I think you're implying, which is a really good question. I want to address it now, which is my assumption that better oversight leads to better national security. There are many people who disagree with that, right? So I got into a big argument with some people who shall not be named, but very thoughtful academics, also former policymakers. He said, how do you know that Congress isn't going to screw things up if they do more oversight, right? Not all oversight is good oversight, right? And my response is intelligence is too important for the executive branch to go it alone, right? So if you think about what is oversight, I think oversight, and there is no clear definition in the literature, but oversight really consists of Congress playing 4 roles, ideally, right? The first role is the policeman, correcting violations of the law and preventing violations of the law. The second is a board of directors, right? Making sure that we're deploying our resources against priorities. This gets to the appropriations point. The third role is ambassador, and this is one we often don't think about, but in intelligence it's vitally important. Actually, because they're secret agencies, only the congressional committees can actually generate the kind of public support that and be the ambassador between the intelligence community and the public. They can't do it themselves. And I can't tell you the number of intelligence officials who have said, I wish Congress would play a better role at letting the American people know what we're doing and all the helpful things that we're doing, because we can't get out there and do it ourselves. And then the fourth role is kind of sort of a coach role, which is constantly making sure that programs are effective and pushing for improvements as they go along. Now, often these things don't work very well for a variety of reasons, some of which I've explicated today. But so I want to actually address the sort of half-assed question about, not half-assed, half-assed question about how valuable is oversight anyway, right? Okay, so that's that. Do we have more expertise now after so many years in Iraq and Afghanistan? I don't know the short answer in terms of the number of people in Congress now who are veterans compared to before, but my belief is the Fever and Cohn book talks about the decline. Peter Fever and Dick Cohn of North Carolina and Duke have done this analysis, and what they found is that after the draft ended, the proportion of members of Congress that are veterans went way down. And in fact, if I'm correct, I don't know if their data is current, that the proportion of veterans in Congress is lower now than the proportion of veterans in the population at large. You're saying maybe yes, I see some nods in the back. So in any case, it's not appreciably higher. And I would add that it's typically military experience, not quite the same thing as intelligence experience. How many former CIA officers do we have in Congress? 1. Right? So I don't see that necessarily getting better in the near future. Pre-term limits, was oversight better? There were no pre-term limits, because when the intelligence committees were created in the 1970s, they were created with term limits. So it's too soon to tell what the difference is, the before-after picture in the Senate, which is the next sort of logical test. Term limits end in 2005. Has that appreciably improved intelligence oversight, holding all other things constant? Don't know yet. Too soon to tell, right? And then your final question, appropriations, and have they increased? You bet they have. Appropriations have increased a lot. The intelligence budget, which is now the top line declassified, has grown dramatically since 9/11. And for those of you who saw the Top Secret America series in the Washington Post, outsourcing to private firms has grown dramatically as well. Doesn't mean that that money is being spent better. In fact, what you're hearing a lot, both from Secretary Gates in the Pentagon, and you hear it from the new Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, is that budgets are going to start to come down. They're going to have to decline. So it's not a money problem. It's a efficiency problem. Yeah. Alan, I'm worried what you're going to ask me.
No. Softball. Alan from the LBJ School. I want to ask you about this limited expertise issue because some folks listening to you might think, oh, intelligence is the only area where Congress has limited expertise, and in fact, it's closer to a pervasive problem. But the difference is that in many other areas, Congress can call on affiliated organizations with great expertise. So if it is a scientific issue, they can request a study from the National Academy of Sciences. And in the old days, if it was a technological issue, they could ask for a study from the OTA, the Office of Technology Assessment. And if it's a budgetary or other sort of oversight issue, they can ask for a study from the General, used to be the General Accounting Office, now it's the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. It seems to me one of the differences with Intel is that the committees can't ask these folks for it. Yeah. And as you know, there's been a big sort of controversy over whether they can call on the Government Accountability Office to do studies. So I'm wondering if you could do two things. First, explain to us the controversy. Who's in favor of allowing the congressional committees to call on the Government Accountability Office to do oversight studies? Who's against it? And why have they won? So that's question one. And then question two is, if Congress could call on the GAO, do you think that would help this problem substantially or not?
Great question. You're absolutely right about that. It's kind of a depressing thought, actually, that intelligence is not the only area where members of Congress are not experts, but even less so than other policy areas. In terms of the GAO debate, so GAO is Congress's watchdog, right? And it's a very effective organization for engaging in oversight of what the executive branch is doing. There's been a fight over whether the GAO could be involved, particularly in the CIA, for years. And so in reality, the GAO has actually been used in the Defense Department in some of the intelligence programs there. And in fact, GAO has people, one of the concerns was clearances, but GAO has a sizable number of people that have SCI clearances, so the highest sensitive compartmented information clearances, and a large number of people that have top secret clearances. So the clearance issue is kind of a canard. So right now there's a bill before Congress that is trying to get GAO to be able to do work in the CIA and other elements of the intelligence community that it historically has not been doing work in. I think this would be a dramatic improvement. But in fact, the Obama administration has objected to this provision in the authorizing bill. And so what you have is Congress actually asking for more help in oversight and the administration saying no. And as far as I can tell, the reasons why the administration is saying no is because the CIA doesn't want anyone else mucking around in the CIA's business. And they have been very successful under Director Panetta about protecting their own jurisdictional equities. I think it really comes down to just about that. That said, I think there are some other techniques that Congress is trying to use to try to mitigate its own oversight weaknesses. And the one that I'm writing about next is the creation of the offices of inspectors general. So this is an area where Congress and the executive branch both see that they need to oversee another part of the executive branch, and they can't do it very well because they don't know everything that's going on in these agencies, and they have mutual interests in creating an inspector general who has the power then to investigate what's going on inside these agencies. So I think that's another sort of area of contention that you're going to see. But I think GAO would be a dramatic improvement. So, yeah.
These agencies do have IQs. I mean,
they do.
They all have IQs, and they all report independently to the IG. So I'm just wondering, if this oversight issue, if maybe you're not making more of this oversight issue than there really is. There are independent IGs. They do subscribe to the Yellow Book. They do subscribe to independent professional organizations in terms of their procedures and their policies. And they're in there. They're in there making those inspections. And I think that what we're talking about is the difference between oversight and policy generation. I mean, the oversight is there. The question is it still valuable to have a $9 billion satellite system with some severe limitations? That's a policy issue. That's not an oversight issue, because the program could still be running properly, and it could be, the funds could be expended and appropriated in a way that Congress has approved.
Well, I think we may have to disagree on this one. I think there are many people who disagree with you.
In terms of arguing that the IGs are sufficient oversight to make sure programs are running well. They're not necessarily sufficient at all, that they investigate what they want to. Some IGs are more powerful than others. And you're right, though, that it is focused primarily on sort of wrongdoing and waste and abuse. And what that doesn't get to is not only just the policy issues, but it gets to the macro strategic level issues. Are we doing the things we should be doing? And if we're not doing, and are we doing them well enough? And if we're not doing them well enough, what should we be doing differently? And the IGs don't get into that territory. Congress gets into that territory. But the problem, of course, as you know, is that if something goes wrong, there's nothing like a scandal or wasteful spending to get members of Congress to jump into the fray, right? So the IGs may find it, but Congress is going to hold hearings anyway. So there's a lot of time devoted toward that kind of what went wrong oversight, and not a lot, or not nearly enough devoted to how can we anticipate what our needs are going to be in the future kind of oversight. Just to give you one example before 9/11, which I'm most familiar with, is oversight of the FBI's intelligence capabilities. So there was split, really, between the Judiciary Committees and the Intelligence Committees. And so the FBI, actually 3 years before 9/11, wrote this brilliant strategic plan. It's a great document that said, we need to totally change how we do business. Terrorism is our top-tier priority. The typical law enforcement stuff we've traditionally done is our lowest priority. We need to have intelligence capabilities in everything we do, and we need to fundamentally transform the culture and the organization of the Bureau in order to meet these new threats, including terrorism. 3 years before 9/11. Who in Congress is actually looking to help the FBI make this transformation as these lone soldiers are going out trying to actually institute this program? Nobody. Nobody held a hearing about it because the Judiciary Committee thought it was the Intelligence Committee's responsibility, and the Intelligence Committee thought it was the Judiciary Committee's responsibility. So a couple of executives in the FBI were left to try to do this alone, and they didn't succeed. So I think there's a lot more that Congress can be doing. I take your point about the IGs focusing on the waste and abuse, but that's not nearly sufficient. Right? Yeah.
Along those lines, you were talking about it takes a scandal for Congress to do anything. Even after they do anything, nothing happens. I mean, I would think that this whole piece on torture and waterboarding, the whole 9 yards, and the lack of oversight, when you have the Speaker of the House being questioned, what she knew, when she knew it, I didn't know anything. At what point are we, or is Congress or somebody, going to make any kind of fundamental change? If something like that doesn't do it, the national outrage and even the international, whatever, if that doesn't do it, then literally what's it going to take for something as simple as term limits, or taking a staff and dedicate it solely to, or even pulling out of the Appropriations Committee, one dedicated only to Intel, because of the fact that it has grown exponentially over the last few years. I mean, literally, in your opinion, is there anything short of another 9/11 that's going to get their attention enough to change the policy or the procedure?
Can I interrupt just one second to ask people who pose questions to identify themselves?
I'm sorry. Jeff Jackson, Army Foreign Area Officer, South Asia.
Okay.
It's a great question. I'm going to give you an even more depressing answer than the question you asked me, which is I think the next 9/11 won't be enough. Right? So I think what we've seen is if ever you would expect a crisis to induce major change in how Congress does business, it should have been 9/11. Right? And then if ever you would expect a crisis to induce change in how Congress does business and looking at intelligence, it should have been Iraq. And then if ever you would expect there to be a crisis that induced change for Congress to change how it does its business, it should have been detention, black sites, interrogation, rendition. Right? And as you suggest, we haven't seen dramatic changes in how Congress has done its oversight, other than to say more people should be briefed, right? And so members of the intelligence community, former senior people, have said, look, we could have briefed more people, but we didn't need to brief more. Now, we don't know whether that's true because we don't have access to all that information, right? So it could have informed more people in Congress about what the Bush administration was doing in particular. But, you know, there's this big debate with Speaker Pelosi about was she briefed or wasn't she briefed? Looks like she was, at least in February of 2003. Whether she was in September of 2002 is sort of a CIA word against her word, and no one really knows for sure. But you're absolutely right. It wasn't enough to actually change how Congress fundamentally does its oversight. Let me suggest, you know, John McCain a few years ago actually sponsored a bill to put that appropriations power in the Intelligence Committee in the Senate. It's the only time that this measure has come before a full Senate vote. It's never come before a vote in the House, the only time in the Senate, and it was defeated 73 to 24, I believe. Every single member, except one, on the Appropriations Committee voted against it. And the only one who voted for it was Senator Mike DeWine. And the reason he voted for it, I think, is because he stood to get that power right back because he served on the Intelligence Committee. Right, so these are really entrenched positions that are going to be really hard, I think, if not impossible to change. I hope I'm proven wrong, but I don't have a lot of faith that these changes are coming. Yes?
Professor, I really want to thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Robert Love. I'm an MPAS student. I really want to thank you for criticizing Congress in their oversight and their role in intelligence. Clearly, they failed on a massive scale. And I wanted to ask you what you think of the 9/11 Commission report concerning that was conducted by members of Congress under Philip Zelikow, especially considering the blaring omission of the collapse of Building 7, which held the SEC offices, IRS offices, and Secret Service offices. They mentioned Giuliani's bunker was in there, his emergency bunker, but they completely omitted that building fell down.
You know, I think there's been a lot of criticism of the 9/11 Commission and what they left out and what they put in. It's a long report, and not everything's going to be in it. And I think there's been some criticism that some systematic things were left out. I guess my take on the 9/11 Commission is not every recommendation that the Commission made was a sensible recommendation, right? So I often say the Director of National Intelligence, the main recommendation of the Commission, was a bad idea whose time had come, right? It was basically an idea that had been kicking around for years in Washington, and I think the politics of these commissions are that you want to have something that's actionable quickly. And reorganization looks big, and it looks big right away. And so Congress seized on the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, and we got this now behemoth DNI office. And my fear then, which I told the Senate Intelligence Committee, you can see how persuasive I was that the risk was that we were going to have this new bureaucracy that was going to fail where every CIA director had failed for half a century before. Because you can't coordinate this community easily, especially if Congress doesn't give you a lot of power over people and money. And that's exactly what we got. So I think there was this sort of aura around the 9/11 Commission that it was sacrosanct. And I think now, as time has passed, people are beginning to question a little bit more the politics behind the commission, and I think more importantly from my perspective, the wisdom of some of the recommendations. I will say this. If you read that report, and it's a beautiful read, it's hard to say about a government document, but it really is. It's beautifully written. The section on Congress is right on the money. And that part called congressional oversight dysfunctional and also warned that it would be one of the most important and least likely improvements to be made. And they were right about that. So, yes.
Thank you. You covered excellently the so-called this tug of war between the intelligence community and congressional oversight. But what's there to say that the tug of war between intelligence agencies? Robert Baird, in, I guess in several books, but See No Evil is one that comes to mind. He mentions that once the FBI took on this role of being an intelligence agency, again, there's this great deal of acrimony where, like, the motor oil between intelligence communities is sharing intelligence and sharing efforts and all that. But again, I think this turf war came down to the intelligence community. Where does congressional oversight factor into that? Is it encumbered due to this tug of war, interagency, turf wars. Does it overcomplicate things? So where does that factor in? And again, Robert Baer was saying this goes back before 9/11. Like you're saying, with the FBI releasing its report 3 years before 9/11 happened, the foundings with this were decades before today. So I mean, it seems like where does that factor into the oversight, and how does that influence the dynamics of how intelligence communities are oversighted?
Yeah, so we now have 17 agencies that constitute our federal intelligence. We had 12 before 9/11, and now it's kind of crazy, right? So if the main problem was coordination before 9/11, the answer is usually not create more agencies to coordinate, but that's in fact what we did. And you're absolutely right that long before 9/11, legendary acrimony between different agencies. In the 1980s, in my last book looked at the FBI and the CIA and why they failed to adapt to the rise of terrorism in the 90s, 10 years before 9/11. And one of my favorite quotes that I got from an intelligence official for that book was in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, the CIA and the FBI decided to exchange counterterrorism officials to try to improve those relationships. And the program was referred to as the hostage exchange program, right? Gives you a sense about what it was like. But congressional oversight certainly impeded that coordination. Look, it was never good between these agencies, and they're still fighting the fight to hash these different agencies together in an integrated whole. But congressional oversight exacerbates these problems. So the FBI goes before the Intelligence Committee and gets grilled about what it's doing in counterterrorism. The FBI goes before the Judiciary Committee and gets grilled about the number of agents doing white-collar crime in Minneapolis, right? So different committees are focused on different things, and there's not an alignment of committees and executive branch responsibilities. And nowhere is this worse than in Homeland Security and intelligence. So when the 9/11 Commission wrote its report, they found, I believe it was 88 different committees and subcommittees that had some kind of important jurisdiction over Homeland Security issues. That number is now 86. Right? I may have the exact number wrong, but it's down by 2. Right? So it means it's still very fragmented in Congress, and you can't expect the executive branch to work well together if there's no one in Congress with the jurisdiction to ask, how well are you working together? So you're absolutely right. I think you can't get the kind of quantum improvements in the executive branch intelligence reform effort without serious realignment of the legislative branch. Yes?
Hi, I'm an Army fellow, David K. Marshall. I guess the question I have is you talk about the turf issues, and this is in conjunction with Congress, but you have a national director, and what is the power of the national director versus the turf areas of the people that control their own budgets in the process, and how willing are they to move and to act without the national director having enough power?
Well, it looks like, and it's kind of a work in progress, that the Director of National Intelligence, in my view, and people disagree with this view, never had enough legislative authority to knock those heads together, didn't have the authority to transfer people, hire and fire people, say yes or no to budget requests as he should have, although more now than previously in the past. But that's only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is clearly leadership. Now, I'm a political scientist, so I tend to sort of discount leadership. But as a real person, you know leadership matters at some point. The question is how much. And I think what you see is this confluence of weak legislation and poor leadership with the last Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, who left the DNI's office weaker when he left than when he came. And he did this in part by picking the wrong fights, in my view. I think he did 2 things that I think were particularly damaging to the capabilities of the DNI's office. The first was he picked a fight with the CIA over who had the authority to designate chiefs of station, so the lead dog in the intelligence world abroad. Now, in reality, the CIA is mostly going to appoint those people, right? Most of them are going to be CIA people. He didn't need to pick that fight. He could have just done it on a case-by-case basis. But what he absolutely shouldn't have done is pick a fight with the CIA early in his tenure and lose it, right? If you're going to pick a fight with CIA to show that the DNI has power, you win that fight. Don't pick a fight you're going to lose. And that set the DNI's office back a lot. The second problem I think that he encountered was after the Christmas Day bomb plot. For those of you C-SPAN junkies in the room, I was, of course, glued to the hearings. I admit that I actually watch C-SPAN on more than one occasion, and I enjoy it, which is kind of sad. But if you look at those hearings, Admiral Blair went before Congress, and he sounded like a critic of the Obama administration. He didn't sound like a member of the Obama administration. He was criticizing the intelligence community, which he's supposed to be in charge of, right? And he also, in that hearing, for reasons that elude me, talked about the interrogation of Abdul Muttalib. I don't know, for those of you who remember this, there was a big debate about should he be read his Miranda rights or not, and who should interrogate him. And as it was, the FBI, from what we know now, actually did conduct an interrogation and then read him Miranda rights, and he got his lawyer, and he's since cooperated. But there's big debate about this. And Admiral Blair in Congress actually said stuff that was just wrong. He said that he objected to how the interrogation was handled. He's supposed to be in charge of how the interrogation was handled. And that we should have activated this thing called the HIG, which is a new creation called the High Value, I think, Interrogation Group is what it stands for. Except for a couple of problems. The HIG had actually not been created yet. It was just an idea that was in development, and it was never designed to interrogate people on American soil. It was designed for interrogations abroad. So he goes before Congress in this highly high-profile hearing after the Christmas Day bomb plot, sounds like a critic of the Obama administration, and actually says he would have done something different than what they did. This is not good, right? From that day on, his days were numbered. So he was weak in the internal bureaucratic battles, and then he became weak externally in the politics of intelligence. How much Clapper can actually, this is the new Director of National Intelligence, can repair that damage? We'll have to see. But he's got his work cut out for him. I think the big thing for those of you who are interested to watch is what's the relationship with the President's intelligence advisor, John Brennan? Because there is a shadow DNI, and it's Brennan. He sits in the White House. He's not confirmed. And that relationship and the relationship with CIA will determine how strong that Director of National Intelligence position will be. And I think this is the crucial juncture. It's make or break time for the DNI. If it doesn't get stronger now, it's never going to get stronger. Yes?
I'm Alan Colligan, I'm LBJ School student. To walk this line of discussion a little bit into the middle of your presentation and talking about the power relationship between the Oversight Committee and the intelligence community as a whole. So since the 9/11 Commission report, there's been a lot of public talk about the defragmentation of the intelligence community. And you made a good point about how operationally there may not have been a lot of defragmentation. We have more agencies than you did before. But at least politically, the interface between a lot of these committees and the White House or in Congress is supposed to get more streamlined. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into what the extent of the change in that relationship that you see in terms of the committee's work. So does the committee's work in terms of their lack of expertise get easier because they have a more streamlined or a more coherent structure? And in terms of the end-run problem, are the agencies who have pet projects, are they getting stronger because they can act in concert and have a powerful liaison with the Appropriations Committee? Or are they losing their end-run power because there are fewer top-level intelligence agencies who get to make their own case?
Great question. I can't tell you because these end runs, which is the reason why I glommed onto that New York Times reporting and really chased down everything that was publicly available about it, they're very, very hard to know about because they're all done in secret, right? Because you're talking about the classified world. Now, I have a security clearance, but I can't publish stuff that I acquire secretly without putting it through pre-publication review, which I don't want to do. So all the information that I'm presenting is based on unclassified material. So I don't know the answer to that question, whether the consolidation, or I wouldn't really call it consolidation, whether the structural changes in the intelligence community have made that problem worse or made it better. My supposition is under General Clapper, you're going to see fewer end runs because the one thing that he really knows well is major acquisition programs. So, and he's promised Congress in his confirmation hearings that he would take a hard look at those programs and take a hard look at the budget and pare it down. Because the timing of his hearings, this gets into sort of politics, right, was the same week that the Washington Post came out with Top Secret America. So there's a lot more political pressure on this Director of National Intelligence to actually not have those things happen on his watch than there was even a week before he was nominated. But we just don't know because I just don't have access to that information. Yes?
Yeah, I've always been, I'm Gary Daniel, I'm a retiree. My question is this: I've always been intrigued by the background and credentials of CIA directors. The thing that I'm most perplexed by is we had a CIA director, Porter Goss. He went directly from the Congress to CIA directorship. I think he was in office only for a few weeks in the CIA directorship, and then he was out, maybe a few months. That's the shortest tenure, and it was not really covered by the press. Why was that? Why was his tenure so short?
Well, it was a very troubled tenure to begin with. I mean, there was sort of, this is a little bit inside baseball, but he brought what were called the Goslings with him, which were staff members from the committee that had a lot of axes to grind back with people. So he used to work in the agency. So a long time ago, he was in the clandestine service. Then he went to Congress, and then he went back to the agency as director. And there were some people who had some axes to grind. And so the reporting was that really good people were leaving because they felt political pressure from him. And that came back to bite him. And then there was the Dusty Fogo scandal with, I mean, do you think only Hollywood could make this up? With, what was it? Contracting prostitutes and gambling in the Watergate Hotel, right? So there's a confluence of things that really led to scandal, and it was really the catalytic event for Goss's departure was the scandal of his number 2 or number 3. So that's why he didn't last long. But in general, I'm glad you raised the issue of tenure, because short tenure in an organization is a pretty good indicator that the organization is in crisis. The CIA went through this in the 1990s during the peace dividend when the workforce was cut 25%, and you couldn't give away the CIA director's job, right, for very long. It was a revolving door. We have that now in the Director of National Intelligence. We're on our 4th DNI in 5 years. And we also have it in the FBI's top counterterrorism position, which has averaged, now the average tenure of that position is 13 months. You cannot change an organization when you have that kind of turnover at the top. Well, thank you all so much. It's been a delight.